Chapter 8: The Sandbox Strategy. The localized server logs for the regional text feeds were scrolling so fast they looked like a blurred cascade of neon green code. Deep within the vast, echoing subterranean cavern of the Level 2 fortress, the atmosphere was absolute pandemonium. The frantic clack-clack-clack of thousands of players furiously typing out theory-crafting essays on their mechanical keyboards merged with the deafening roar of primitive blast furnaces, the blinding white glare of manual plasma torches, and the echoing, confused shouts of thousands of Wave 2 rookies who were still trying to figure out how to calibrate the hydraulic pressure lines on their newly assigned loaders. Surviving a direct encounter with an official reconnaissance convoy of the Imperial Planetary Defense Force hadn't just given the community a massive haul of pristine military-grade loot. It had injected a heavy dose of industrial adrenaline directly into the heart of the server's fragile economy. The honeymoon phase of the initial wave launch was officially over. The crushing, unyielding reality of trying to establish a rogue foothold on Tartarus IV, a world utterly consumed by fractured, paranoid bureaucratic wars, stalked by hidden xenocells, and choked by constant, skin-melting sulfur storms, had finally set in. And the players were doing exactly what sandbox gamers do best when faced with an uncompromising, high-friction environment. They were searching for every single hidden mechanic, logic exploit, and optimization curve to push their scrap heap base to its absolute limit. Inside the drafty, structural scrap tent that served as the temporary command headquarters, the air was thick with the suffocating stench of burnt promethium oil, wet iron rust, and stale synthetic nutrient paste. There were no sleek, glowing holographic tables or automated strategic map overlays here. Those advanced features were locked tightly behind the blueprint for the base level 5 command center, a milestone that felt miles away. Instead, Trashcan, Copperhead, and a dozen other prominent guild leaders from the self-proclaimed Alpha Vanguard were leaning over a dented, grease-stained metal table. Their avatars' heavy mechanical boots crunched loudly on the loose volcanic gravel every time they shifted their stance. Pinned to the table with heavy, rusted structural rivets was a physical paper map of the surrounding basin, painstakingly hand-drawn by scout players who had physically driven the grid lines in low-emission buggies, dodging Imperial patrols and acidic mud geysers to chart the terrain. Global server infrastructure counter is sitting rock solid at level 2, and we are still missing 90,000 units of refined iron and plasteel to trigger the level 3 upgrade event, Trashkin said, his voice cutting through the local voice channel with the distinct metallic hiss of a low-grade comm unit that was fighting heavy ambient radiation. He tapped the blunt end of a heavy grease pencil against the paper map, right over the narrow, jagged gorge where the Torox convoy had been dismantled. The 3 armored transports we dragged into the lower tunnels represent the highest quality military-grade alloy the server has ever touched, but the general forums are turning into an absolute tire fire. We've got 3 different industrial mining guilds threatening to go on a full labor strike if we don't allocate the harvested plasteel to their specific construction pipelines. Let them scream on the boards, Copperhead muttered, his avatar standing with its arms crossed over his chest. His unarmored loader was parked just outside the tent flap, its massive, unshielded diesel engine block ticking loudly as it cooled down in the damp cavern air. We have 40 Imperial PDF prisoners sitting in a cage right now, and if we don't figure out a definitive faction policy for them within the next 20 minutes, their local hunger and hydration tics are going to start causing permanent health degradation. We can't afford to let free labor rot in a cage just because the general chat can't agree on a build path. The prisoner issue was the first major systemic hurdle the community had to collectively resolve. In a standard, traditional role-playing game, captured enemies would either vanish into a cutscene or remain static, non-interactive entities behind an indestructible set of bars. But this world operated on strict, uncompromising physical realism. The 40 PDF conscripts were currently locked inside a makeshift holding cage constructed from rusted, welded cargo containers near the cavern's eastern air shafts. They were huddled together on the freezing, damp rock floor, their stained gray Imperial uniforms caked in toxic yellow silt, shivering from the sheer drop in temperature inside the subterranean depths. To the players, these NPCs were a collection of numbers, potential resource multipliers, and lore vectors. But to the NPCs themselves, they were living through an inexplicable, terrifying nightmare. They had been ambushed in a blinding sulfur fog by towering, silent scrap metal monsters that wielded industrial plasma cutters like executioner blades. They had seen their heavily armored transports torn apart not by the unholy, screaming mutants of chaos cultists, or the elegant, terrifying killers of an Eldar strike team, but by a disciplined, grimly silent labor force that moved with an uncanny, hive-mind coordination. The cargo container doors groaned as Trashcan walked his heavy loader up to the iron bars, the twin high-intensity spotlights mounted on his machine's shoulders snapping on simultaneously, blinding the prisoners in a harsh white glare. The captive PDF sergeant, a hollow-cheeked veteran named Marcus whose flak jacket was scorched black from lasgun feedback, pushed his way to the front of the huddle, shielding his eyes with a dirty, trembling hand. He expected the worst. On a world as brutal as Tartarsivy, when a military detail went dark in the wastes, it usually meant they were being skinned alive by penal rebels or offered up to dark gods by the hidden cults that festered in the underhives. "Listen up, conscripts," Trashcan's voice boomed through his loader's external loudspeakers. The audio gain cranked so high it caused a sharp, piercing feedback squeal that made the prisoners wince and press their hands to their ears. "We don't have the food rations to keep you as permanent decoration, and we aren't wasting the ammunition to execute you. Your governor back in the Hive City doesn't even know you're missing. His data logs think you were ambushed by House Vandy's corporate thugs. As far as the Imperium is concerned, you're already dead. Your names have been scrubbed from the active registry, so here is your new reality." With a heavy mechanical clunk, the loader's left cargo claw dropped a massive wood-and-iron crate onto the gravel outside the cage. The lid split open, revealing rows of clean, unpolluted water canisters and thick blocks of gray synthetic nutrient paste, rations that were vastly superior to the maggot-infested sludge the PDF command fed its low-tier conscripts. Alongside the food lay 40 heavy, industrial-grade pneumatic picks and iron shovels. Option 1, Trashcan continued coldly, the mechanical whine of his loader's chassis punctuating his words. "You sit in this cage, you don't work, and we turn off the filtration vents to this sector. You choke to death on the ambient sulfur seepage within 48 hours. Option 2, you take those picks, you join the civilian refugee squads in the western tunnels, and you dig. The void aura generated by our Lord's sanctuary protects this cave. No psychic static, no cultist whispers in your sleep, and 3 square meals a day. If you dig well, you get upgraded to civilian status, and eventually we might even give you your weapons back. What's it going to be, Sarge?" Sergeant Marcus stared at the crate of clean water, then looked back at his men. These were young boys press-ganged from the sulfur finery slums of the Hive cities, men who had spent their entire lives being ground into dust by corrupt imperial overseers, only to be handed a rifle and told to die for a governor who didn't even know their names. Here, in the dark, surrounded by mysterious, heavily armored masters who spoke to each other in a strange, silent language, there was something terrifying, but there was also food. There was safety from the horrors of the planet's surface. There was a weird, heavy sense of peace in the air that none of them had felt since they were children. Marcus reached through the iron bars, his fingers wrapping around the cold, heavy handle of an industrial shovel. "Give us the rations," he rasped, his voice cracking from dehydration. "We'll dig." The notification popped up simultaneously across every player's user interface on the server. Server event updated, the workforce grows. 40 Imperial PDF conscripts have been integrated into the labor force. Subterranean excavation speed increased by 8.5%. Base level 3 population requirement, 2040/2500. A collective cheer went up in the regional text chat, a massive wave of emojis and joke messages flooding the screen. By choosing option B, the community hadn't just avoided a messy alignment penalty, they had successfully automated a massive chunk of their manual excavation grind. The 40 conscripts, deeply familiar with the brutal, repetitive discipline of Imperial work details, immediately began organizing the civilian refugees, showing them how to properly shore up the loose volcanic rock walls with timber and scrap iron beams to prevent catastrophic cave-ins. While the manual labor engine was being optimized in the deeper tunnels, a completely different breed of player was gathering in the dark corners of the central scrap tent. These were the lorehounds and data miners, players who completely ignored the mechanical combat and mining loops in favor of exploiting the game's intricate, multi-layered political faction systems. They were huddled around the recovered leather-bound Imperial data slate that Copperhead had ripped from the lead Torox's dashboard. The slate was a heavy, archaic piece of machinery, its green cathode ray screen flickering with encrypted high Gothic text runes. A player named Codebreaker, whose avatar wore a ragged, oil-stained tech priest cloak over a basic industrial welder's frame, had spliced a series of copper leads from a salvaged loader battery directly into the slate's primitive logic board. "This is pure gold," Codebreaker whispered over the local party channel, his fingers flying across a physical keyboard he had mapped to his in-game text console. The official Imperial Governor's office is completely blind. Because Tartarsivy is a fragmented world where the governor holds almost zero actual authority, his military logic engines are incredibly paranoid. The logs inside the slate prove that the PDF command already suspects House Vandes, one of the major local noble houses, of running illegal, unregistered promethium refineries in this exact sector to avoid paying their segmentum tax tithes. So if we play this right, Goblin said, leaning against an ammunition crate while cleaning the glass lenses of his long rifle, we don't just hide our tracks. We turn the entire planetary government into our personal wrecking ball. The players chose option A, a full-scale political frame-up. For the next 3 hours, Codebreaker and a squad of tech-focused players treated the data slate like an advanced, manual cryptography minigame. They didn't just wipe the logs, they meticulously edited them. Using fragmented audio files harvested from the dead PDF officers' comm channels, they used primitive in-game editing tools to patch together a corrupted, static-laced Vox recording. To the game's AI logic engines, it would sound like a House Vandes security detachment had intercepted the PDF convoy, explicitly ordered their execution, and authorized a complete cover-up to protect their illegal promethium assets. To complete the ruse, they injected a falsified navigation coordinate into the slate's internal compass, showing that the Torox transports had been diverted toward a heavily fortified Vandes, mining perimeter right before the signal went dead. Once the forgery was locked in, a high-level stealth scout player named Shadowstep volunteered for the delivery. Operating a low-slung, electric-drive buggy with its headlights completely blacked out, Shadowstep slipped out into the howling sulfur haze of the surface. Navigating by the brutal topography of the ridges, he drove 40 miles out to the edge of the sector, navigating close to an official Imperial Highway checkpoint manned by the governor's remaining regional guardsmen. With absolute precision, he planted the cracked, scorched data slate in the middle of a muddy tire rut, scattering a few spent casings from a corporate pattern heavy stubber around the site before melting back into the yellow fog. The political fuse was lit. Within 24 hours of game time, the data slate would be recovered by an Imperial patrol. The weak, hyper-paranoid governor would see the forged logs as a direct, treasonous declaration of economic warfare by House Vandes. Instead of launching a coordinated hunt for a hidden player base, the official Imperial military machine would begin grinding its gears for an administrative security lockdown against their own noble rivals, leaving the players completely free to expand in the shadows. But while the political players were celebrating their shadow victory, a massive ideological war had broken out in the main cavern over the ultimate fate of the salvaged Torox plasteel. The server's forum thread had hit over 2,000 replies in an hour. The player base was completely divided into 3 distinct archetypes: the turtles, who wanted to spend the metal on base defense, the sweats, who wanted to maximize material refining efficiency, and the vanguard veterans, who wanted to build heavy weapons to hunt higher-level mobs. Because the Level 2 base lacked a centralized faction leader with absolute dictatorial coding powers, the community did what any massive group of internet gamers does when faced with a resource crisis. They compromised by splitting the loot into 3 unequal piles, determined to accomplish a little bit of everything at once. The result was a beautifully chaotic, hyper-coordinated industrial push that showcased the true power of a sandbox player base. The first third of the high-grade Imperial plasteel was dragged down to the northern bottleneck of the ravine by a massive cooperative convoy of over 100 players. Working alongside the newly compliant PDF prisoners and the civilian refugees, the construction guilds set up a line of manual plasma welders. They took the heavy, thick side panels of the destroyed transports and physically welded them into a towering, 3-ton heavy blast door across the narrow throat of the ravine. It was a brutal, ugly piece of engineering. The welds were thick, bubbling, and lacked any aesthetic symmetry, but it gave the settlement its first actual tactical choke point. For the first time since launch, the base was completely sealed against sudden subterranean incursions or the flesh-melting chemical deluges of the planetary superstorms. The second third of the salvaged metal was delivered directly to the sweat guilds stationed around the crude, hand-built smelting furnaces at the back of the cavern. These players completely ignored the combat mechanics of the game, focusing entirely on numbers and progression curves. They took the precision-engineered internal drive gears, hydraulic pumps, and promethium injectors from the Torox engines and systematically dismantled them. Using basic hand tools and raw metallurgical calculations, they integrated these high-tier military components into their primitive Level 2 smelting arrays. The jury-rigged upgrade was an immediate success. The manual fuel pumps allowed them to inject pressurized sulfur gas directly into the charcoal burners, skyrocketing the furnace temperatures far beyond their original design limits. The conveyor belt system, primitive as it was, meant that hauling squads could dump raw iron ore into sorting bins rather than carrying individual crates by hand over a 3-mile trek. The server-wide notification flashed green. Base efficiency upgraded. Smelting and material refining times reduced by 22%. Resource degradation from acid rain exposure reduced by 15%. But the real masterpiece of the entire event, the project that had thousands of players crowding around the repair tents with their in-game camera tools active, belonged to Copperhead and the elite mechanics of the Alpha Vanguard. They had claimed the final third of the armored plating, the twin-linked heavy stubber turrets, and the main structural chassis frames of the vehicles. For 12 straight hours, the repair tent was a blinding storm of blue electrical arcs and white-hot sparks. Copperhead and his team completely stripped 5 standard industrial loaders down to their bare, skeletal walking frames. They threw away the flimsy civilian pipe roll cages that were designed to protect pilots from falling rocks, replacing them entirely with the thick, rivet-studded sloped armor plates cut from the Torox hulls. They reinforced the leg actuators with heavy-duty military suspension springs, packing the joints with salvaged industrial grease to prevent the sulfur fog from seizing up the gears during prolonged combat. The real engineering headache was the power distribution network. The standard civilian engine core of an industrial loader wasn't designed to feed a military-grade weapon system. To mount the heavy, twin-linked Imperial heavy stubbers, the mechanics had to run heavy, exposed copper conduits from the ammunition feeding trays directly into the loader's main fuel cell, overclocking the generator's RPM limits into the dangerous amber zone. When the massive canvas sheets of the repair tent were finally pulled back, the local server chat completely exploded with hype. They hadn't officially unlocked the game's actual Tier 1 Enforcer mech blueprints yet. The base level was still too low, but through sheer sandbox ingenuity, creativity, and structural calculation, they had created something entirely new, the Torox Loader hybrid. It was a hulking, terrifying, asymmetrical monster of a machine. Standing nearly 14 feet tall, the frontline chassis was covered in overlapping, sloped slabs of rusted gray Imperial plasteel, complete with the original military serial numbers still visible through the grease. The left arm retained its massive, high-pressure pneumatic cargo claw, capable of crushing concrete blocks or snapping an enemy's leg bones like dry twigs. The right shoulder mounted the massive, twin-barreled heavy stubber turret, its ammunition belt winding down into an external drum welded onto the rear hull. And on the right arm, Copperhead had permanently integrated his custom, high-frequency industrial plasma blade, connected to a series of pulsing cooling lines that hissed with pressurized steam every time the engine cycled. Copperhead climbed up the metal ladder into the reinforced cockpit, the heavy armored hatch slamming shut with a deep, pressurized thud. The machine's engine roared to life, a deep, guttural diesel rumble that shook the loose gravel across the cavern floor. As he panned the machine's twin high-intensity spotlights across the thousands of cheering players gathered in the dark, he opened his Vox mic to the entire server. "The civilian tier is officially over," Copperhead's voice crackled through the camp, deep and distorted by the heavy military comlink. "We built every single inch of this place with raw sweat, salvaged iron, and calculations. The next time the governor's office or the local noble houses come down into this valley looking for their missing soldiers, they aren't going to find a bunch of defenseless miners. They're going to find a war." Deep inside the Hive City's central administrative spire, 40 miles away, a low-ranking data scribe pulled a cracked, muddy data slate from an intake bin. As the green screen flickered to life, showing the forged logs of a brutal House Vandy's ambush on an official government convoy, the scribe's eyes widened in sheer terror. He immediately punched the file up to the high-level logic engines of the governor's private security council. The gears of a massive, paranoid imperial bureaucracy were officially turning. Regiments were being mobilized, corporate bank accounts were being frozen, and sirens were beginning to wail inside the boardroom spires of House Vandy's. The planet Tartarsivi was slowly, violently sliding into a self-destructive proxy war of attrition. And in the dark, silent spaces between the warring factions, the player lord's subterranean fortress was silently growing teeth, preparing for the inevitable day the storm finally broke over their heads.